Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Magnus versus Hikaru. Today we have a game from 2005 where these two chess legends who were teenage grandmasters at the time face off. And Hikaru Nakamura has the white pieces, and we see here looks like his rating was 2662 at the time, and Magnus had a 2570 rating, and so this is back in 2005. And the game begins with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez opening. And so here the game continued with a6, a common move in this opening, which forces this bishop to make a decision of whether to capture the knight or retreat. And usually the bishop retreats, and that's what Hikaru did in this variation. And so now we have knight to f6 here, attacking this pawn on e4 and developing. And the game continued with castling here. And in this position, Black moves bishop to e7 next. And if you're asking why he didn't capture this pawn, that is a possibility. But then the game would open up more before Black has castled. And it would look something like this. After capture, White plays d4 to try and open the center up even more and get an attack on the king, which is still in the center here, before Black has a chance to move his bishop and get castled to safety. And so after a further capture, we would have rook to e1, pinning this knight to the king. And so d5 is possible to protect the knight. But then we have knight takes d4, recapturing one of the pawns and also attacking this knight on c6, which is currently pinned by this bishop on a4 to the king. And so the game may proceed with this move, bishop to d6, just ignoring these attacks. And it shows here that White's best move, according to the computer evaluation, would be to capture here on c6. But then we have this possible crazy combination that would continue with bishop captures on a2 check. And the best move for White is to not capture, but to move to h1. And then this knight is not able to fork the king and the queen because of this pin by the rook. And so Black will move his queen down here, threatening to move the bishop away with check for a discovered attack. And then we have rook takes e4, checking the king and attacking the queen. And then after capture, we have this move, queen moving up to d8, checking the Black king, but it's not checkmate, as the queen would have to recapture here. And then after capture, the king captures. Now finally the White king captures the bishop, and then after bishop to e6, bishop to g5 check, and the king moves. So this is a possible variation that could play out, which is just kind of a crazy position where it's unbalanced. Black has more pawns, but White has two pieces for one of Black's rooks, and he also has the bishop pair. And so I guess both players wanted to avoid this possible situation, and instead, if we go back, after White castles, Black does not capture this pawn. Instead, he just plays bishop to e7. And now it is a threat to capture this pawn, as if the position opens, black can just castle here. So now white moves the rook to defend this pawn in the center. And then the game progressed with b5 attacking the bishop, and the bishop moves away. And then black castles to safety. And then now white moves immediately to d4 here, trying to gain space in the center, attack this pawn on e5. And then d6 was the reply, protecting this pawn on e5. And then we have c3, fortifying the center and also leaving an escape hatch for this bishop in case the knight attacks it here. And so now we have a pin on this knight. And a lot of times in the Ruy Lopez, white will play this h3 move early to prevent this pin from happening, as this can be a little annoying, this pin on the knight to the queen here. And so next we have bishop to e3, helping to control the center here and fortify this d4 pawn. And then here we have e takes d4. But there is the possibility of the knight taking this pawn, and another crazy continuation where the players both avoided this possibility. But if the knight captured here after bishop to d5, it looks like white is just forking and winning a piece here. But if we look at the computer evaluation, it's still only plus 0.2 for white. So white would get a small advantage. So that and how crazy this position is and difficult is probably why it was avoided by Magnus. And so this is what would happen. The queen could come up and protect here, and then the bishop would capture this knight, and then we could have d5 chasing this bishop away. So after the bishop retreats, we have e4 pinning this knight to the queen by the bishop, and it's under attack. And so here h3 just attacks the bishop. So then after capture, the queen captures this pawn and is close to the king side with possible threats here. But then after white captures, f5, helping to bring this rook into the attack on the king side. And so the game could progress with knight to d2, helping to bring another piece to white's defense on the king side. And then after captures, we have knight captures. And then the rook can move to f3 here, putting more pressure on white's king side. And now the knight repositions here because it was under attack and it's attacking the rook. And so here the queen checks and the king must move. So then h3, and if the king would move back to g1, here we could just have a draw. White could move back and forth and the queen would check and just check back and forth, and it'd be a draw by repetition. And so instead of king to g1, if the king moved to e2, then we have another possibility here with rook captures with check, the pawn captures, and then queen to g2, and after the king moves, we have the knight moving in here with check. And these moves would be difficult to find, especially for average players, but it was such a crazy continuation. That's probably why it was avoided in this game. And here we have another possibility of queen check. If the king moves, queen check again. So here's another possibility where white could just move back and forth and it would be a draw. And so queen to g6. Instead, white could play e4 to try and avoid this draw. But after a capture, rook captures, rook checks on d8, and then the king would move. And once again, the queen could just start checking. And the king tries to run from these checks, but the queen just keeps checking. And it could just be another possible draw where the queen just checks and checks. And here, this is possible. Or another possibility, if we go back, let's see here. Make sure I have the right move. All right, after h3 earlier in the game, we had king to g1, and then the game could have continued with this checking back and forth. So anyway, it looks like in that possible crazy variation that could have occurred, it would just end by another checking back and forth with the queen and a draw by repetition of these checks. And so the players avoided that. If we go back to the game, after the pin on this knight and this move, black avoids capturing this pawn on e4 and going into that long, crazy sequence that we just looked at that is complicated, but if played correctly would lead to a draw by checking over and over by repetition. All right, so here instead black captures, and then the pawn recaptures, and then we have this knight moving here to attack the bishop. So the bishop retreats, and then we have this pawn jumping forward and also attacking this d4 pawn. So the d4 pawn captures, the pawn recaptures, and then we have h3 attacking this bishop, forcing it to make a decision on whether to capture or to retreat. And so first, the queen captures here on d1 after the bishop recaptures. Now we have a bishop retreat, keeping the bishop pair. And so the knight develops finally off the back rank up to d2, and many times in the Ruy Lopez, this queenside knight will move to d2 and then to f1, and from f1 it can reposition to h2 and then g4, or go immediately to g3, or sometimes even to e3. And that's a common sequence of moves by this knight from b1 to d2. And now we have knight jumping in here to c6, getting off the edge of the board and repositioning back towards the center. And so white moves to g5 with his knight, attacking this bishop on e6. And so that attack is ignored, and we have a pawn push here, threatening to push this other pawn and force through a passed pawn. And so a3 is played to prevent this other pawn from moving to b4 to try and help this pawn forward. And so the rook moves to help control this open central file here, the d file, and then the bishop moves off the back rank and helps fortify this pawn on e4. And then we have a bishop finally retreating, and now we have f4 e4. And so this knight moves here to reposition and to help control these squares from this bishop. And the knight now moves back. As it was under attack, it could have been captured and the pawns would have been broken apart, leaving this isolated pawn if that happened. And then after knight to c5, we have e5. The pawns, white having the majority of pawns on the king side. Usually it is a good idea to push the unopposed pawn forward and try to break that one through for a passed pawn in the endgame. And so this bishop jumps down here to d3, deep into black's position, or excuse me, white's position. This black knight is attacking this pawn on b2, and so it is exchanged off. And the rook recaptures here. And now we have knight to e4. And then the bishop is attacking this knight. And so the knight jumps up to d6. And here the players agreed to a draw. And so this is where the game ended. But I am curious what might have happened if this knight was captured by the bishop, and then if the pawn recaptured and the rook were to capture and go ahead a pawn here. Let's see why that was not played. So if bishop captures and pawn captures, the computer does not show a rook capture of this pawn as the best move. It is not even listed on the top 3 moves here. So it recommends f6, which I see why that's a good move. It would keep this knight out of black's position. But what would happen if this were captured? Oh, okay. I see now. If this was captured, the bishop could attack the rook and it would be pinned to the other rook, and so we'd have a trade of bishop for rook. And so that's why this rook cannot recapture this pawn immediately, as this bishop would attack from c5 both of these rooks. Okay, and so I hope you've enjoyed this game of 2 chess legends when they were young teenage grandmasters back in 2005. And it was a very tense game with a lot of possibilities that were not played out, and they kept the game solid and safe and agreed to a draw in the end. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions. Thank you and have a great day.